Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Very happy to see that so many of you came here today. We already had, for the politics junkies amongst us, we had an election night last night in the front of the television at the bar, and I was a little bit afraid we would cannibalize this event. But with the man who's sitting next to me coming here, there was no reason to be afraid. Mr. Curtis he just told me that he has observed Japan for 50 years, this year actually. So for all of us who haven't been here that long, like me, he's an incredible source of putting things into a bigger context of understanding what really went on last night. I'm not going to make a big introduction. Most of you know him already very well. My name is Patrick Zoll. I'm working for the Swiss newspaper Neue Zürcher Zeitung. And before I forget, please turn off your mobile phones. Please, Mr. Curtis.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many people here today. And I know, given what your profession is, you want to ask a lot of questions and don't want me to give a long speech. So let me try to be kind of brief and just touch on a few of the highlights. So the first point, of course, is why was there an election? And I think that was a question that a lot of Japanese were asking themselves, and about half of the voters said there's no reason for an election. They didn't bother to vote. So the voting rate is the lowest ever, 52%. Clearly, there was no enthusiasm for this election. It's what I was saying to Patrick. I feel for any journalist who has to write a story about this election to try to explain two things. The LDP had a landslide, and the public doesn't particularly like the LDP or the prime minister. Put those pieces together and explain this election result. So I think this election was probably the results were driven by two things. One is the public wants political stability. They had 6 years of revolving door prime ministers. The worst thing than having Mr. Abe as prime minister is not having Mr. Abe as prime minister. There are a lot of people who like Mr. Abe, but the public opinion polls show that his support has gone down. But even so, I think the desire to have a stable government here for the next several years is very strong. And then what this election was, I think, mostly about was a vote of non-confidence in the political opposition. The idea that there is no alternative to the LDP and to Mr. Abe. From beginning to end of this very short election campaign period of 2 weeks, neither the Democrats nor any of the other opposition parties, with the exception of the communists, were able to figure out what they were opposed to and what they supported. So listening to some of the campaign speeches of the opposition, you thought they were giving endorsement speeches for Mr. Abe, saying they really think Abenomics is the only road forward, but he's not doing enough on the trickle down and so forth and so on. So what we saw was an opposition that, as I said, doesn't know what it wants to tell the public about the policies it supports that is different from the LDP. Next, the way the campaign was conducted by Mr. Abe and the LDP suggests that he did not get any mandate because he didn't offer anything in the way of ideas about what he wants to do to get the public to say whether they agree or not. He was very cautious and very careful, basically to say, this election is about continuing Abenomics. We're half the way there. Michinakaba, we're in the middle of the road. Trickle down works. Companies are getting, are making money. Now it's going to trickle down to the general public. You'll start feeling the benefits soon. Did he say anything specific about new bold initiatives on the economic front? No. Did he say anything specific about foreign policy? No. Did he say anything about nuclear besides the kind of vague language about, as long as they're safe, we're going to we'll have them come back on? Not really. Agriculture? No. In short, there wasn't much here in the way of specific issues. To many people, this looks like a return to what those of you who are familiar with Japanese political history know is referred to as the 55 system. The 55 system, the system that was begun in 1955 when all the conservative parties kind of coalesced into the LDP, and the socialist parties into that one socialist party, and the LDP dominance was then unchallenged really for 38 years until Prime Minister Hosokawa became Prime Minister. This is not a return to the 55 system. The 55 system was a system in which the opposition never was able to take power, but in which it acted as a very strong brake and check on power. And while the socialists never got more than about a third of the vote and a third of the seats, it got a lot more of support from the public on specific issues. And when it did, the LDP in those days took those issues and made them its own, including issues about peace diplomacy and so on. So Mr. Abe is not saying anything that the founders of the LDP in 1955 didn't say about wanting to revise the Constitution, have Japan have a more normal, more normal military, bigger military, and so on. This has been on the LDP agenda from the beginning. But when you had the opposition strong enough to get public support for other policies, the LDP responded by embracing those other policies. This is not the 55 system. This is something that we may. It only became the 55 system kind of in retrospect. I think this may be seen as the Juyonen Taisei, the new 2014 system in which you have one very strong party that is not, in which the internal competition is not structured like it was under the 55 system, factions and groups arguing over policy, and no strong opposition. This is good news for Mr. Abe, and it's good news for the LDP. It's really very sad news for Japanese democracy, in my view, that after 70 years of trying to develop a modern political party system, the system has imploded, and I don't see it getting better anytime soon. And this is maybe too academic for what you're looking for today, so I won't go into detail. But this election system that Japan has of single-member districts, plus this PR component, but particularly the single-member districts, no system could be more inappropriate for a country like Japan than this system. And as long as they have it, you're not going to develop a two-party system in this country. That's my view. I'll be happy to explain the reasons why. And a lot of politicians in this country agree with me that the system they had until 1993 of called medium-sized districts, was much better. But nobody, it's true in any country. Once you've been elected under the system that exists, the last thing you want to do is see it change because you're not sure whether you're going to get reelected under a different system. That's the problem Japan faces. That the election system has produced. What else do I want to say? So the results themselves, big success for the LDP, particularly a big success for Mr. Abe. Essentially, the situation today is the situation that was yesterday. That is, the LDP Komeito coalition has essentially the same number of seats it had going into the election. LDP lost a couple, and the KMT Komeito gained a few. So they had 2/3 of the seats before the election. They have 2/3 of the seats now. In the last days before the election, there was a lot of optimism in the LDP and speculation in the press that actually the LDP was going to do a lot better and may even get 2/3 of the seats on its own. Well, it didn't. It came out more or less where it was. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that in many districts there was no competition. The DPJ ran candidates only 178, if my number is right, 178 of the 295. Yeah, that's right. 178 of the 295 single-member districts. So there were a lot of districts where there wasn't really any opposition candidate, except for the communists. So the results, good for Abe. It makes him stronger vis-a-vis his own party. I think he ran. So one question is, why did he call an election now? Caught everybody by surprise. Of course, now that people say, well, I kind of suspected he was going to do it, but they're all lying. Just about everybody was caught by surprise by this decision, but you can see in retrospect what it was about. I think he did it for two reasons. One was to take advantage of the fact that the opposition was totally unprepared for an election. The DPJ, after losing 2 years ago, has done virtually nothing to reflect on why they lost, to apologize to the public for screwing up their great opportunity, to get ready for an election. They thought they had time, and Abe took advantage of that. So they couldn't find candidates to run in a lot of these districts. So he took advantage of the opposition's unpreparedness. I think the other reason for this election, because there was no reason to have this election, to have it now. He could postpone the consumption tax increase. You don't have to call an election on that. But I think one of the reasons was, if he had postponed the introduction of the consumption tax and not had an election, he would have run into enormous criticism from within his own party, in which there's a lot of support for going forward with the increase as scheduled. This shut them up. Once there was an election called, they can't attack the prime minister for having made that decision on the consumption tax, and so he quieted the opposition within the LDP, and he won. And now that he's won, it's very difficult to take him on that and other issues. What does it all mean in terms of going forward? Well, the honest answer is no one can really be sure what it means, because we don't know how Abe is going to play it. But having said that, this is my take. Don't look for bold new economic reform, for third arrow to be suddenly shot right at the bullseye over the coming 6 months to a year. I think we're going to see pretty much more of the same. There's a lot in motion. Things will continue, but labor market reform, major labor market reform, I don't see it. I don't see it happening. Nuclear, they'll get the Sendai plant in Kyushu up and running probably sometime early next year. Getting any significant number of nuclear power plants back online is not made easier by this election. It's not going to happen so easily. The best thing that can happen for Abenomics is really, to some extent, in the hands of the United States, not in Japan. That is, if now that the Republicans have a majority in the Senate, Congress, after January 1st, moves towards approving Trade Promotion Authority for TPP, that will make it possible for Abe to show his final cards on compromising on agriculture on TPP. There's no way you can expect Japan to show its hand if it doesn't think the Americans in return are going to actually go forward with approving an agreement. So I think if there's a TPP, if there's a movement towards, if there's confidence in Japan that the U.S. will approve fast track and that an agreement will get through Congress, then I think the chances of a TPP agreement increase. And if you get an agreement on TPP, it has a huge impact on domestic policy that Abe will have to follow through on, and particularly in the area of agricultural reform, right? So that's the one wild card in this deck. As I said, that really depends more on American politics than on Japanese politics. So I think the end of this expensive expensive election in which there were no real issues being debated, the consequences are, one, the opposition is in worse shape than ever. I know some people say, well, now, your party is gone, the Jisedai, the next generation party run by all these people who are over 80. They should have been called the next generation, really their grandchildren's generation. But anyway, that pretty much gone. Only two of them survived the election. Socialist Party is pretty much history. Communists did well, but it's, Communist Party, until it changes its name, isn't going to become a major force in this country. So you're down to two opposition parties, essentially, the Democrats and the Ishin Noto. The Ishin Noto did okay. It only lost one seat when people had predicted it would lose half or more of its seats. So they're still around, and maybe they'll be talking with the DPJ about some kind of reordering of the opposition. I don't hold my breath. I think it's going to be a long time before we see an opposition party emerge that in any way can contest the LDP. The only way there's been a transfer of power in this country in the post-war period up to now is by having the LDP split. That's probably the only way it will happen again, but there's little reason to believe that that's going to happen anytime soon. So the big question about Mr. Abe that I think is on a lot of people's minds, especially foreign observers, is how much will he use this position of strength he has to push the issues he's really interested in, which are constitutional revision, raising Japan's profile on the world political stage, becoming more of a so-called normal country with normal military, without the constraints and so forth and so on. We've seen since his Yasukuni visit last December that he's been very cautious, very careful about the language he uses in talking about history. And the question is now, will he sort of revert to the Abe we've seen before? Who can't be sure, but I doubt it. I think he's pragmatic and will and understands the high price that's paid by raising these issues of wartime history and seeming to excuse away Japanese actions. But there is reason for concern. Next year is the 70th anniversary of the end of the war. This is a time that should be a celebration of the past 70 years of democracy, of peace, of a huge Japanese contribution to the economic development of all of East Asia, to all that Japan has been and all that it rejected of what Japan was before 1945. That's what this should be about. But the danger is that it will be about what Japan was and no longer is, but which some people, vocal people on the right, would want either to, I wouldn't say they want to bring it back, but they want to somehow find something to be proud of in a period when there isn't much to be proud of in the 1930s and 1940s. So you have to worry about, you have to be concerned about that. Yesterday, was either yesterday or the day before, Xi Jinping attended this first memorial for the victims of the Nanking massacre. And, the Japanese press coverage is kind of interesting. The Yomiuri title was, I happened to bring it in quotation marks, 300,000 people murdered. Japan, I never know how to say this right in English. Nihon wo kensei suru. So they're kind of putting sort of putting a check on Japan. That's the title. But what the speech was, it was remembering the victims of the Nanking massacre. But then went on to actually, Xi Jinping used almost the exact words that Mao Zedong used when he met with Tanaka Kakue in 1972 in Beijing, when Tanaka started to apologize for the war, and Mao stopped him and said, "That's not necessary. This war was created by a group of militarists in Japan, and the Japanese public was as much victims of the war as were the Chinese. That was the beginning of the reconciliation between China and Japan. And that is the speech that Xi Jinping gave yesterday. But the Japanese press all have that in the very last paragraph of the speech and focus on the point that the Chinese say 300,000 when it was not 300,000. So if it's 100,000, does that make it okay? There's really a dumb argument to argue about the number. How many comfort women were actually forcibly dragged by their hair to be prostitutes, and how many were deceived or in other ways trafficked sexually? That is not something to argue about. Anyway, I think in the short term, at least, Sino-Japanese relations they're on a better track. I think the signals coming from Beijing and from Abe is they want to try to improve the relationship. We'll just have to see how much Abe thinks that this now gives him carte blanche to do things that he wants to do. And the one thing he really wants to do, and I'll stop right here, the one thing he really wants to do is to get the public to understand why they should scratch a constitution that was written by Americans and force down the throats of the Japanese and have their own. And that's what they need to do to be a proud country. The fact of the matter is, yes, the Constitution was drafted by the American occupation forces. It was embraced by the Japanese, and it has been supported by Japanese ever since. And what is interesting on this issue is that after Abe became prime minister this time and raised this constitutional issue, the more he did, the more opposition to revising the Constitution has grown in public opinion polls. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much for this, Mr. Curtis. It was so comprehensive. I'm not sure if there are any questions left, actually. But I just surely hope so. If you come up, please state your name, your affiliation. One question, please, and as short as possible. Siegfried.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. You said Japanese voters voted for Abe because he guarantees continuity. But if you look at the year before the Abe government, I think the economy was in better shape. Foreign relation was in better shape with China, and perhaps China not, but South Korea. So why had the other government not a better result, even if they changed the prime minister every year?
So if I say that foreign relations were better before Abe than since Abe, I don't think that's true. People have short memories. When the DPJ was in power, Mr. Noda had terrible problems with South Korea, arguing about comfort women and dokdo. It was Noda that made a really foolish, I think he did it in a very foolish way, this nationalization of the Senkaku Islands that led to a crisis with China. And I am absolutely convinced if the LDP had been in power at that point, they would have called Ishihara's bluff and would not have made that move, but just have prevented Tokyo from buying those islands. I hold no brief for Mr. Abe, but let's be realistic. When the DPJ was in power, Mr. Noda stated in the Diet that he thinks it might be necessary to reconsider the interpretation of Article 9 to permit collective defense. After the crash between the Chinese fishing trawler and the Japanese Coast Guard in 2010, and the release of a YouTube video that was put on by a member of the Japanese Coast Guard, the Noda government began to draft a bill to have a Classified Secrets Act. They never got it to the Diet because they lost power before it happened. Yes, the Democrats did not increase the defense budget But that was because the economy wouldn't support it. And what Abe has done is not all that much. 0.8% the first year, 2.7% this past year. I think it's very important to distinguish between what Mr. Abe means as Prime Minister and what any government would do given the international situation Japan faces. And I think things like a minimal reinterpretation of the Constitution on collective defense, modest increase in the defense budget, relaxation of restrictions on Japanese defense policy, including weapons exports and so on. This is going to happen. If Mr. Abe were to leave office tomorrow morning, you cannot imagine anybody becoming prime minister who would not continue those basic policies. I think Abe has made two important differences as prime minister in Japanese foreign policy. One is positive and one is really negative. The positive one is that he has raised Japan's profile, especially in ASEAN, especially in Southeast Asia. We've known Japan to be a major economic, visible presence in Southeast Asia and politically invisible in that region. That's not true today. And Abe's been, to every one of the 10 ASEAN countries. He's been to some more than once. It's mostly economic, but not entirely. Japan is providing, paramilitary ships to the coast guards of both Vietnam and the Philippines. Abe wants Japan to walk on the political stage with its head high. It raises all kinds of questions that I won't bother to get into. But on the whole, this is very positive. And when you get beyond China and Korea, Japan is a very popular country. Popular in Southeast Asia, popular in Africa, popular in just about everywhere you go in the developing world. Very popular in India and so forth and so on. So, developing almost a quasi-alliance with the Australians, developing a security dialogue with the Indians and with the Vietnamese and the Filipinos. I don't think this is up. I think this would have happened anyway. But Abe has put a lot of emphasis on this. The other thing that Abe has made a real difference, and gets to the point I made before, is the suspicions he raises about whether his revisionist views of history have something to do with his vision of Japan's future. And that is not only a concern for the Chinese and the Koreans, it is a big concern in the United States. And these recent articles and editorials, Los Angeles Times just a few days ago, blasting Abe on his revisionism, Rich Cohen in the Washington Post doing the same, New York Times with the series of critical essays. This reflects something very that this government has to take very seriously about the image that's being conveyed, and nothing does more damage. I say this in my speeches to Japanese audiences all the time, and I'm getting a lot of pushback. So the more pushback I get, the more I'm saying it. Nothing is doing more damage to Japan's image in the world than its efforts to explain away the comfort woman issue. This is a disastrous thing. And when I tell them, we have a good adage in English. When you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you got to do is stop digging. Don't get yourself into a deeper hole by trying to defend Japan on this issue. Anyway, so that's the question about how much his views of the past influence his views of the future. He wrote a book. There's a book. It's a taidan, a conversation between Abe and Hyakuda Naoki, the novelists, and Zero no, what is it? The movie about kamikaze pilot and so on. So this book has a title in Japanese. I think I remember the title. In Japanese, it's called Nihon yo, well, probably Nippon yo. Sekai no manaka de. Sekai no manaka ni saki hokore. And it has on the cover in the English equivalent, Japan, be proud at the center of the world. Well, if this is the vision of the future, this is not a vision, this is a delusion. Japan is not at the center of the world. It's a big, major economic power, an important player in the world, but it's not at the center of the world. My point here is that the concern about Abe is What is his vision of this region and his vision of Japan's role in this region and the world? Next year, the 70th anniversary, he will issue his Abe Danwa, his Abe statement following on the Murayama statement. That's the opportunity for him to explain a vision that is reassuring to the neighbors and to the Japanese public, to the U.S. and to others. So in short, you asked a good short question. I'm giving a much too long answer. I don't think that Abe has changed the basic strategy all that much, or that to the extent it's changed, it would not have changed had someone else become a prime minister, but and that he's done something very positive for Japan in raising its profile, especially in ASEAN and with the Australians and so on. But we come back again to how this history issue hangs as a terrible cloud over Japan today.
Anthony, please.
Anthony Rowley, Singapore Business Times. Thank you for a sobering assessment. I think some foreigners, including myself, do have concerns about possibly Japan drifting back to some of the values of the 1930s, but in terms of loss of individual freedoms, in terms of political extremism and so on. But of course the context is different now from the 1930s, so how far will the checks and balances prevent that happening, do you think? And what's the implications of all this for the election, for Japan's relations with the rest of Asia, especially East Asia, of course?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic that the public, the public sentiment here will not be amenable to going back to 1930s kinds of restrictions on individual freedoms and much less using the military for expansionary purposes. I don't buy any of that. I think that's one reason why this conversation about history is so unfortunate, is that a lot of it is trying simply to honor the memory of people like the Prime Minister's grandfather and others, without much implications, I think, for future policy. But having said that, I guess I'm thinking out loud. Having said that, what we see with the Japanese public today is neither a lot of support for what Mr. Abe wants to do or much in the way of opposition, but a kind of acquiescence. And I think you see Abe push the envelope, and then he sees how much pushback there is, and if there's some, he backs off. That was a story of collective defense. He pushed for a much more broader interpretation of what collective defense would permit. Komeito pushed back, but so did the public more generally. And he's pragmatic, and he got what he knew, what he thought he could get, which is really not all that much. But that wasn't his goal. He pushed on the Classified Secrets Act. His popularity took a hit for a month, but it came back. Public kind of accepted it. He's pushing on nuclear energy. There's pushback, but you'll get a nuclear power plant up and running in another few months, and that'll, and as long as it doesn't blow up, there'll be more. So I think Abe is going to keep on pushing out and see how it goes. I don't see, as I said, I don't see real enthusiasm for his policies, but I do think that there's, it seems to me in China and in Korea, there's been an intensification of historical memory in recent years about the war, and the Chinese set up, have established a new memorial to the victims of Nanjing, And the Koreans and the Chinese agree to have a memorial to the man who assassinated Ito Hirobumi. And there's a lot of anti-Japanese stuff that goes on. And historical memory is very strong. And it's been passed down from the generation of the people who suffered under Japanese aggression to their children and their grandchildren over the dinner table and conversation and so on. But in Japan, there has been a parallel loss of historical memory. So you have intensification in China and Korea and a loss of historical memory in this country. This is a period Japanese don't want to think about. It was horrible. People who experienced it don't sit around the dinner table telling their children and grandchildren what they went through during the Second World War. It's not taught in the schools. So that the knowledge of history is becoming thinner and thinner. And it allows people to reinvent history in a way that somehow the Japanese really didn't do anything worse than anybody else, and why should we apologize anymore, and so on. This is what is really worrisome. Yasukuni is a great example. In the early post-war years, up until the 70s, this was a very controversial issue among Japanese, and the public was very divided about whether the Prime Minister should visit Yasukuni. What is Yasukuni now? Yasukuni now is, hey, Chinese, don't tell us how our Prime Minister should pay respects to the war dead. Because there's no sense of what Yasukuni really symbolizes and represented in the past. But that's reality. And so you hope the Prime Minister keeps the national interests at the center of his thinking and realizes that having a positive relationship with China and with South Korea are really important for Japan and for U.S.-Japan relations, and does what's necessary. Right now he's doing fine. I think things in the short run are likely to get much better between China, not much, but get better between China and Japan, and probably between Korea and Japan as well. But these are our real concerns.
Aruko-san, please.
Haruko Watanabe, HKW Media Report to Women. Well, this is a short question and that requires a long answer. You said Mr. Abe raised Japan's status in Southeast Asia, Africa, India, and those places. He always mentioned let women shine. But do you think Mr. Abe can raise Japanese women's status in economy and politics and in community in general? Thank you.
I don't have such a long answer to that question. Look, I think, first of all, what the Prime Minister, whatever his intentions and his objectives and commitment are, what the Prime Minister can do to change the culture of Japanese corporations and Japan more generally, to make this, to improve the opportunities for women is limited. There are things he can do, but it's limited. And he can't order companies to suddenly hire, put women in executive positions, especially, you come out of this out of a history in which almost all the people who are in executive positions and on the way to holding executive positions in major Japanese companies are men. So suddenly to put women in those positions, where are you going to find all the experienced women? That's one problem. So I'm somewhat, I think they're going to probably pass a law in the coming Diet having to make it mandatory for companies to establish targets for percentage of women in executive positions. It's not mandatory, but it's kind of. But there'll be targets that'll probably pass. How much influence it will have, hard to say. Probably not all that much. So, but there are two things that I think are pushing in the right direction. One is the demographic realities. Japan's running out of men. I mean, they're running out of people. The population is shrinking. So if you don't have immigration on a major scale, you really do have to bring in a lot more women into the mainstream labor force to compensate for the declining number of people, declining number of working men, and that's happening. And the other, I give Abe a lot of credit that he has done what he committed to do about women where he actually has the power to do it. And that is, if my number is right, this year among the new recruits into the higher civil service in Japan, 37% are women. He had set a target of at least 30% of women recruited into the higher civil service being women, and he's done that. So this issue, this kind of thing, takes time. It interests me that with all this talk about equal rights for women, an issue that was a big issue here some years ago but died, which is the right of women to retain their own maiden name when they get married. That issue is sort of off the agenda. You either have to take your husband's name or he has to take yours. But the Besse issue, Abe opposed it. So it's not really a feminist, but and this let women shine. The expression itself is always kind of bothers me. Anyway, I don't really have much more to say about this. I think we will invariably and inevitably see more women hold major, important positions. But the problem of adjusting so many aspects of the social system to make it more easy for women to have careers and to have family. It's not only nursery schools, but it's working hours. It's all kinds of issues. There's progress. Like everything else in this country, there is progress being made. There are things changing in what I think many of us would think is the right direction. But it's pretty slow going. There's not a revolution occurring in this country. A lot of foreign investors and others thought that Abe represented revolutionary change. No, this is not revolutionary change. But this change, and this change in the role of women in Japanese society, but it probably not the bold moves about equal pay for equal work and all the other things that actually could be done. So that's a somewhat longish answer.
Just quickly follow up to your remark on demographics. Are women just a lesser evil than immigrants for Abe?
I wouldn't put it that way. You can, though. No, I think that, after all, Japanese women are Japanese. That is, there's no language problem. There's no problem of cultural assimilation. It's easier to deal with women who are Japanese than to deal with foreigners who are not. But it doesn't resolve Japan's demographic. It cannot resolve Japan's demographic problem, partly because there is a growing need for workers in sectors where neither Japanese women nor Japanese men want to work unless they have really no choice, and in which there's not enough of them anyway. And that is people to take care of old people. The other aspect of demography here, besides the fact the population is shrinking, is that it's aging so fast. So, the need for kaigo, elder care workers, for nurses, for people who can service an elderly population. That is not going to be satisfied by Japanese women. That's going to be satisfied only if Japan opens up to more immigration for people who can provide those skills. The worst thing about the immigration issue in Japan is that there is immigration, but because there's no system, it's either disguised, it's illegal. People come in and they don't the kind of benefits and security that you would get. If any country, I think if any country could do immigration right, it's probably Japan. Train people, give people basic language training, training in Japanese cultural matters and so on. Japan is really good at doing this kind of stuff. They could do more. We'll see more. I think Abe himself is probably more sympathetic to the immigration, more positive on the immigration issue than he publicly states, because there's so much public opposition. But in the business community, there's a lot of support for a major immigration policy. Maybe we'll see something develop because of these demographic pressures, but it's not an either or. You get either women or you get foreigners. I think with the women, the issue is how do you give women access to mainstream jobs where they can earn the equivalent of men and have real responsibility. For the foreigners, it's a somewhat different issue, serving a different need.
Okay, Richard, please.
Thank you. Richard Lloyd Parry of The Times. Could you talk a bit about the future of the opposition? And do you think, for example, that if there was a full-scale debate on constitutional reform, a kind of Lord of the Rings type last battle, could that galvanise the opposition and the Japanese left in a way that it really seems to need? And the second question is, I would be interested in hearing a little bit about why you think the medium-sized constituency system is more likely to produce political competition.
Okay. Well, the first point is that there's almost nothing left of the Japanese left. So that I think it's a mistake to think about the political opposition as being on the left. And the problem, so what happens to the opposition from here on out? If the constitutional issue becomes the key issue of division, who's on the LDP side and who's in the opposition, many of those currently in the opposition would be on the LDP side. So there are a lot of people in the DPJ who favor constitutional revision. They may not favor the same revision as the Prime Minister does, but there's a lot of support for revising even Article 9. Within the DPJ, there's a strong conservative element that are only in the DPJ because for one reason or another they didn't get endorsed by the LDP when they first ran for office. The problem for the opposition is to figure out what it is, how it differs from the LDP. Abe may make it easier for them to do so over the next few years. In that book I mentioned that Abe wrote with Hyakuta, it's one really very interesting section in which he says, the LDP used to be very unprincipled because they would just do whatever, they would adopt whatever policies were necessary to stay in power. But we have to be a party of principle. In all the books I've written about Japan, my major argument has been what made it possible for LDP to be so successful, and that deserves a lot of credit, is that the LDP was always flexible, taking socialist ideas when they were popular, not being ideologically at one extreme or another. So Mr. Abe thinks this party should be a principled party. You're either for constitutional revision or you don't belong with us. Well, if he actually moves in that direction, that would open the way for a strong opposition to emerge because the LDP would divide. Tanaka Kakue, when he was prime minister, spoke of the LDP as being like a big department store. On the first floor, you could buy these policies. On the second floor, you could buy those policies. And whatever you wanted, just take the elevator to the right floor. You could find the policies you want. And that was the idea of the LDP, this umbrella party that could encompass all these different views and policies, right? So Mr. Abe wants a one-floor, no elevator LDP. And if he succeeds, then there's room for an opposition. But what's most likely to happen is that's what he would like to see, and he'll push in that direction, as I've suggested. But there's a lot of pushback, and the LDP, to stay in power, they will try to reach as wide an audience, constituency as they can. So I'm very skeptical about the ability of the opposition to get its act together. First of all, there's a dearth of political leadership. You can't, now Qaeda is resigning. He lost his seat. He's going to resign as DPJ head. Who in that party is going to turn the public on? Mr. Okada, Mr. Hosono, Mr. Miyahara, those are the names that are up. Yeah, maybe, but And Edano, so are these people going to galvanize a public enthusiasm? Very unlikely. Can the party agree on what it agrees on? Right now, it's hard to see. I think as I said before about this 2014 system, we're in for a period in which the LDP is the only game in town, and to the extent that there is opposition to what Abe wants to do, it's going to be a combination of internal LDP criticism and hopefully a critical media. So how the mass media deals with this new political situation is something that will be very important to see. But I don't see this election as leading to a coalescing of the opposition. The Ishin and DPJ, maybe they'll try to come together, but Ida and Hosokawa and then the DPJ leaders agreeing on who should be leader and what their party should stand for, very hard to see. And the DPJ, as long as it's heavily dependent on the union movement and has this quite conservative group in it as well, it's really apples and oranges. It's hard to see them becoming a real attractive alternative. So I guess this leads to this conclusion. Expect more of the same unless Mr. Abe overplays his hand and drives people into the opposition. If he's clever and cautious, and if his economic policies don't backfire, if deflation is overcome, if there isn't a fiscal crisis, if things slowly get better, he's okay, and so is Japan. So it's really kind of up to him.
There was the second question about the election system.
Oh, the election system. So, the Japanese who wanted this election system changed said, if we had a system like Great Britain, we'll have politics like Great Britain. Two-party politics, or like the United States, two-party politics. But election systems are part of social systems. You have to look at the total society in which they occur. In this country, which there has not been really deep cleavages of class, of race, of region, ethnicity, any of the things that we're used to in the U.S. or in Britain, what the what the single-member district system does, it makes each candidate pretty much say the same thing, because you got to get 50 plus 1% of the votes if there are two candidates, and if you can't distinguish, this half of the room is more or less on the Democratic side, and that half is on the Republican side, if it were American terms. Since you can't distinguish, everybody looks there more or less the same, you're going to end up saying the same thing. So the opposition hasn't figured out exactly what it stands for. And what the public has shown is that in each election, since there's not really clear policy differences, they tend to swing with the breeze. So this time there wasn't much of a breeze, right? There was very little wind factor, either pushing behind the LDP or against it. But you have had these wild swings. LDP wins big, and then the next election, the DPJ comes to power, and then the LDP comes back, and now the LDP came back again. This medium-sized district system had lots of problems, but had two great advantages. One, it forced candidates within the LDP to target their attention on different constituencies within the district. So, if you have 3 or 4 party members of your own party looking to get elected, one is going to focus on the fishermen and the others on the farmers, and some more on the construction industry or whatever. So there was more specificity to what the candidates were standing for than under this system. And second, it made it possible for opposition parties to survive, because if it was a 5-member district, the socialists or Komeito or someone could count on getting 1 or 2 of the 5 seats. So the irony of this is that by the early 1990s, when Japanese convinced themselves that this system was the source of all evil in Japanese politics and should be abolished, the way in which the public's political attitudes had evolved was that it was becoming almost impossible for the LDP to run more than one candidate in most districts, especially in urban Japan, because they would defeat each other. Tomodaore in Japanese. So what you saw was in a 4-member district or 5-member district, 3 or 4 parties would each elect. So you were developing a moderate multi-party system under that system, and then you make compromises in the diet. So it has was becoming much more like a European-style PR system with compromises among the parties in power. This system makes it very difficult to have a change of party, except very dramatic swing. And so since there's no clear, the social cleavages are not so deep and broad, you don't have a social base for each party. That, Republicans have their base and the Democrats have their own, and then they argue, they fight for the floating voter and so on. Here, that's not the case, and what we've seen, just make one more point on this. As with this system, a lot of people who run for election, new candidates, they're not really connecting with their constituency. They're running on the party ticket label. They're running on Abe, the prime minister's popularity. And so I meet a lot of a lot of politicians here, and I have for the past 40 some odd years. So many of these young politicians, they don't know who their constituents are. They're not really invested in their constituency. A great example was Miss Obuchi. She didn't do anything. She didn't even know how her organization was being run in Guma. She had just left it in the hands of the guys who ran her father's campaign. In a single-member district system in this country, you don't need to work so hard. The great strength of Japanese grassroots democracy in the post-war period was that individual politicians had their finger on the pulse of the public in their district, and they knew what their concerns were, what their needs were, what their desires were, and they tried to respond. So yeah, there were lots of problems, but on the whole, I think it's a system. It existed in Japan since 1925, and it produced a somewhat competitive system. At least it was competitive within the LDP itself, and gave the opposition a strong footing. It doesn't exist in this system. So, as I said, I think a lot of Japanese politicians think they made a big mistake by adopting this system. They're probably going to make the mistake worse by reducing the number of PR seats, so that it becomes more of a single-member district system. The problem here is not the PR. The problem here is the single-member district, in my view. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay, there was a question down there. Carsten, it's probably going to be the last question, so please make it short.
Carsten Gammes from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Germany. simple question. How far has this to do with Mr. Abe? Is he really the person changing the politics? You mentioned the pragmatic approach, which has to do with the evolutionary process of opening Japan. Not a revolution, but step by step, from women to free trade and others. And you mentioned the history debate, and you said this interesting sentence, everybody told me, this is what he's really interested in. So is it Mr. Abe who is doing this 2014 system you described, or is there a group? Is this a shadow shogun, Mr. Suga, and some other LDP people at the top that really are the people driving this politics, and Abe is just the face at the moment? And if he would decide himself alone, we would have the history debate and nothing else.
I don't think there's anybody else that's pushing this, and that Mr. Abe is simply the front man or the face. I think Abe is actually pretty much his own man. I think someone like Suga plays a very critical role because he's a great politician. He's very practical minded. I think he keeps Abe's helps Abe keep an accurate perspective on what's going on. But to the extent that an individual is pushing Japan in a particular direction, it's the Prime Minister himself, not anybody else. But the point I made earlier is that what is pushing Japan in the direction it's going, both on the economy and in foreign policy, is the structural changes that are occurring both domestically in Japan and in the world. So domestically in Japan, you have the fundamental demographic problem. Doesn't matter if it's Mr. Abe or if it's actually someone who is much more of a feminist. Whoever is going to be prime minister is going to have to find a way to get women more into the mainstream labor force. Moving away from lifetime employment and trying to figure out how to structure a labor market that's more mobile and in which more people are operating on contract and as these dispatch workers. That is something that any government would have to deal with. Reducing government regulations to try to encourage some more entrepreneurship and more venture kind of activities here, that's something that governments have been trying to do at least since Koizumi, if not since Hashimoto. So it's not that Abe has invented a new approach to economics. He invented a new branding, brilliant in its own way, Abenomics and 3 arrows. And the monetary policy clearly is very different and very new. And he was very lucky that Shirakawa's term was coming to an end just as he became prime minister and was able to replace him with someone like Kuroda. But fiscal stimulus, that's what the LDP has always been about. Spend money you don't have and hand it around to people so they vote for you. That's what fiscal stimulus has been. That's why they have such a huge debt. Fiscal consolidation, yeah, let's do it, but let's not do it this year because it's too costly politically, so put it off. And now it's put off till 2017. And third arrow, so there's been a lot of, most of what Abe is trying to do in the way of the third arrow was on his agenda when he was prime minister the first time. And it was on Koizumi's agenda before him. And it's slowly happening, and it will slowly happen. But it's not Abe. And on foreign policy, the reality is that we no longer live in a bipolar world in which the U.S. commitment to Japan is absolutely ironclad, in which China is now a major power and will become more and more so. So it is inevitable that a Japanese government would adjust its foreign policy to try to deal with these new realities and not simply assume that one, leave it to the Americans. They'll take care of things. It's not possible. Although there are a lot of people here in this country, as you know, and especially in the LDP, say, if only we could get rid of Obama, if only Obama, when Obama is gone, the America that we can trust will be back. But America will never be back as the unchallengeable predominant power in East Asia that it was before China rose to become such an important country. it's a multipolar system that's emerging in this region, and where every country is trying to figure out how to position itself, to protect itself and provide for its security in that environment. This is not Mr. Abe. He has his own approach and his own ideas, but this will be true for no matter who. So I think it's really important to distinguish here between two things that are going on. One is there are structural changes domestically and internationally that are forcing Japan to make bigger changes in the way it looks at its role in the world and the way it organizes itself internally than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And second, you have a prime minister who has very specific views on how to do that, and he's pushing as hard as he can to take the country in that direction. There's a lot of ambivalence, a lot of resistance, and a lot of acquiescence. That is a very tough story to write, so I feel for you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curtis. Thank you very much for being here the next time, however many times it was already, and we hope to have you back many, many times. And in order to improve that chance a little bit, we give you a 1-year honorary membership of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you.